Meets Ludovic Kennedy face-on in Portrait.
John Mortimer is a living example of Shakespeare's line about one man in his time playing many parts. He's been a practicing barrister both in the civil and criminal courts. He's been a writer of film scripts, both original and adapted from his plays and novels, as well as those of other people. He's best known to television audiences for the creator of his larger-than-life barrister Rumpole of the Bailey. He is also a journalist who has conducted interviews with some of the most famous people of our time. Looking back on your life, John, it seems to me that you've tended to accept things as they've come along without really deliberately seeking any of them out. Would that be fair?
Yes, I think that is fair. I mean, I think that I've been open to events, but I think that on the whole, people make far fewer decisions than is realized. I mean, you know, people think they decide who they're going to marry, but the number of available people who actually fancy them at one given time is strictly limited. But I think that my main motive in my life is to avoid boredom, which I'm terrified of. And so therefore I've tried to do as many things, many different things as possible.
That's an occupational disease of writers, isn't it? Evelyn Waugh used to talk about that.
Yes, that's right. I mean, I have a very low threshold of boredom. And so that when I was working at both of my professions, any day which I spent the morning with a murderer and lunchtime with a judge and the evening rehearsing with a lot of actors and actresses was a day well spent.
Of all the things you've done, which have you enjoyed the most?
Well, I think I enjoyed working in the theatre. I think the theatre is the most enjoyable thing, although it's by far the most difficult. But the only thing I really live for is writing. I mean, everything else has been really a sort of fuel for writing or material for writing. So I enjoy writing, if you can call it enjoying things. I very much enjoy finishing writing something, which I've just done.
Where did Rumpole originate?
Well, he had a great deal in common with my father. Rumpole wears my father's uniform, which was a black jacket and striped trousers and cigar ash down the watch chain. And my father had this habit of quoting poetry at very inapposite moments. I mean, when I was 4, every time my father saw me, he used to say, "Is execution done on corridor?" Which, when you're 4, is a very difficult question. So I thought of that habit of my father's of quoting poetry. And a number of barristers I met round the Old Bailey, one of whom actually was in a trial you know very well, in the Stephen Ward trial, who used to call everybody old darling, particularly the judge, but I don't know whether he ever called his wife old darling.
Was that Mr. Burge?
Mr. Burge, yes.
And Voyage Round My Father was of course your father. And he does sound, I must say, a most intriguing character. Could you tell me something more about him and your relationship with him?
Well, it was a most extraordinary relationship, really. My father went blind when I was about 17, and he didn't take very much notice of me until I was about 5. I think he was bored with me, and I well understood that. I think I understood my father. I think we understood each other very well. But when he did take notice of me, he was a wonderful father. He never told me the difference between right and wrong, which I'm not sure that I know to this day. But he told me all about Shakespeare and Sherlock Holmes, and he knew all those stories by heart, and we used to go to long walks and he used to tell them to me. And then when he was blind, I read to him, and I think that was one of the great pluses in my life, because I read a lot of poetry aloud to him. And then when we ran out of things to read, I read him what I'd written, and he had a kind of instant, totally reliable literary judgment. And I still think, in terms of what I write, whether he would have liked it.
Did his blindness make any difference to life within the family?
Well, he never had a lot of friends. He liked to live in the garden. And if visitors came, he used to creep into the undergrowth and hide, you know, until they went away again.
And it had been like that before he was blind?
Yes, but it was more so after he was blind, because the real thing he dreaded was for someone to come and be sorry for him for being blind. So he pretended, not very successfully, not to be blind at all. And he could do that in court wonderfully, because he had a wonderful memory. And he could remember all the dates of all the letters, and he would fix a witness with his clear blue eyes. the witness would think that he saw through them. But he never learnt to do anything with dogs or braille or anything like that.
I think your mother read his briefs to him on the train.
She did, and of course as he practiced in divorce, she had to read out these terrible accounts of, adultery in hotels and male and female underwear scattered about. And the first-class carriage used to grow silent, listening, fascinated.
Were you present on any of those occasions?
Oh, I was, and sometimes I had to read them out myself.
And what did you think about it? I mean, did it...
Well, I was very early. I mean, I was nourished, fed, educated on cruelty and adultery and willful neglect to provide reasonable maintenance, really. And that happened all my life because I was brought up in the home of a divorce lawyer, and then I myself became a divorce lawyer. So when I was very young and living quite a strange and emotional life, I would sit in my chambers and middle-aged company directors would come and ask me how they should conduct their married lives and tell me all their secrets.
You write in your book that his death, your father's death, made you feel lonely, and at that time you were how old? You were...
Well, I was getting on to be
towards
30, yeah.
Yes, that's right. And is that right? You did feel lonely when he died?
Oh, yes, I still miss him, very much indeed. I admired... There was a sort of English stoicism about him, this way of never admitting that anything terrible had happened to him and carrying on just the same. And there's a story I always think about the Battle of Waterloo, when the cannonball comes and strikes off the leg of Lord Uxbridge, and Wellington says, "My God, Uxbridge, you lost your leg," and Uxbridge says, "Oh yes, my God, so I did." I find that very admirable.
I thought didn't Wellington say, "By God, so you have"?
So you have, that's right, yes. I admire that, and there was something like that about him.
What about your mother? Were you close to her at all?
No, not so close, because my father and I had this incredible alliance in which we used to talk in a language mainly made up of Shakespearean quotations, and which my mother, I'm afraid, was a bit isolated. And I got sent away to those dreadful sort of schools that we were all sent to at that period. And I never blamed my father for that in the least. I could quite understand my father wanted to get rid of me. I never quite understood what I'd done wrong, why my mother wanted to get rid of me. And it wasn't really until the end of her life that I really became very, very close to my mother.
After your second marriage?
After my second marriage, and she came and went for the first time on an aeroplane and came to Italy and spoke Italian, which she'd learned.
Is it true that on seaside holidays, your father and mother used to go and stay in a hotel and park you with a nanny in a boarding house?
Yes, they did. And I mean, my sort of first early visions of my father is of him lying in sort of foremost to bed with golden curtains, sucking his handkerchief, and late into the morning I'd be brought in and taken away again. But I don't think I ever minded that particularly. I think I had rather a good time with the governess in the boarding house. And
you had, I believe, some rather eccentric neighbours.
Well, when in my sort of teens, we had the two lesbian ladies who appear in Voyage Round My Father, who introduced me to a very exotic world of the writings of Cocteau, and dyed their doves and dried them in the linen cupboard. And so I heard then of the sort of exotic life of the south of France, which went to my head, because, of course, there it was, the war was on, and we had no chance of going to the south of France.
So you didn't, in fact, enjoy your school days very much?
Well, I went to a very good prep school called the Dragon School, which was very exciting, and I did act Richard II. And I don't think my life has ever had a more triumphant moment than when I was Richard II at the Dragon School. But I didn't enjoy it at Harrow at all.
In fact, didn't you fantasize at your early school about being Fred Astaire?
Yes, I told endless lies. I think that in childhood you lie the entire time, and then with any luck your life catches up with your fantasies. And so when you're old you don't have to lie anymore, which is a great relief. But I certainly used to say that my parents weren't my parents at all, but in fact I was a child of some Russian aristocratic family who was smuggled out on the Trans-Siberian Railway, which in fact was going in the wrong direction for my story. But I really didn't want to be, and I also was rather keen on being the child of a broken home. I don't quite know why that was. I suppose because I was so surrounded by divorce. And I thought there was something very glamorous about having parents whose marriage had broken up. And I was always saying, you know, my parents' marriage is going to break up any moment. My mother goes to a cocktail party. Of course, my mother never went to a cocktail party.
It couldn't have been a less broken home.
No, and then I used to take people home, and there would be my parents boringly sitting holding hands, devoted to each other.
Did you ever want to become an actor?
Yes, that was the real thing I wanted to be. I wanted to be Noel Coward. I wanted to come down a white staircase in evening dress and sit at a white piano and play. But as I couldn't sing, dance, anything like that, that was rather closed to me. But I certainly would have wanted to be an actor.
And did that last into your Harrow days?
Yes, it did a bit, although I didn't really act at Harrow. And I acted a bit at Oxford, but not very successfully.
At Oxford, I think you didn't join the Ards, did you?
Well, I did a play. Well, yes, I did a play. I didn't act a great deal. And, of course, the war was on when I was at Oxford.
At Oxford, you read law.
Yeah, a great mistake.
Yeah.
No lawyer should ever read law. It should be forbidden to lawyers to read law, because reading law is one of the dullest things in the world. And law has got no life at all in it unless you're actually involved in a case. So, and I used to have to resort to terrible books called Potted Torts in a Nutshell, you know.
You then, when the war started or fell, you didn't take part in the war because, like your father, you had bad sight, didn't you?
Well, yes, and I was also, if you can believe it, excruciatingly thin. I was going to pass away out of thinness. And so I went into this strange government film unit. And, in fact, I wore a uniform with scriptwriter written on the, on the shoulder of it. And I worked in the film unit.
Was that a different world to the one you knew?
It was absolutely different. I was brought up in a very middle-class environment. I went to middle-class schools, and I'm sure you remember how totally segregated those schools were. I mean, not only did we never see a girl at Harrow, we never saw any member of the working classes unless they helped us carry our suitcase up at the beginning of term, or were a footman or something that served you cabbages. And then suddenly I was in a whole world which was utterly new to me, a world of film technicians and continuity girls and people who called me John and behaved as, you know, as though they were friends, which was new to me.
Did you find it difficult to adapt to them?
Not at all, and I was very happy, and I have always enjoyed tremendously being with film crews and film technicians. Actually, watching people film is one of the most boring occupations in the world, but the people are very nice.
Had you by this time, because latterly in the Crown Film Unit they made you a writer, had you by this time more or less decided on a writing career?
Oh yes, I had. When I had to give up being Noel Coward, I knew that I was going to be a writer. And I wrote a story when I was at school at Harrow, and someone said, "Are you going to be a writer?" And I said, "Yes, that's what I'm going to be." So I knew I was going to be a writer. And then I was a fourth assistant director, and I was incredibly inefficient. I couldn't say quiet, please, because I was too timid. So they all went on hammering and shouting and making loud and so on at the beginning of every shot. And I actually lost 15 electricians on the road on the journey to Liverpool, so that some great moment of history, which was some bomber rising into the air, couldn't be filmed because I'd lost all the electricians.
How do you mean you'd lost them?
Well, in some way I was in charge of them on the train to Liverpool, and in some manner they escaped me at crew or something, and then never were found again. So they said, "You probably do less harm if you're a writer." And the writer then was Laurie Lee, and he wanted to leave. And so they said, "Well, if you can write a film script that Laurie Lee approves of, you'll be all right." So I did, and he did, and I began by writing scripts.
But you didn't really know at that time, apart from this, what you wanted to write about.
No, I knew I wanted to write. I mean, I suppose I'd written, everyone had written an unpublished novel, sort of Aldous Huxley type novel I wrote at school. And then I wrote a novel about that experience in the film unit, which was published and was rather successful when I was really quite young, in my very early time.
And yet after the war, you joined your father's profession. You became a barrister. Was that really just to pay the bills?
Yes. Well, he'd always assumed that I would be a barrister. And I always told him that I was going to be a writer. And he said, "Of course," I mean, he was very clever. He didn't say you can't be a writer. He said, "Of course you'll be a writer. You'll be a terribly successful writer, but just until, you know, make a fortune as a writer, do a little, divorce a few people. There's nothing really in it, you know, just to please me." So I passed the bar exams with some difficulty. And I went into his chambers and that's what I did.
Was his advice to you there good, do you think? Or do you think that you should have said, no, I'm not going to waste time doing this, I'm going to be a writer or be a journalist and learn my trade? What was your view?
Well, I spent a lot of my life trying to think of the answer to that question. And I spent a lot of my life wondering what I was going to do when I grew up. Until I was about 50, I was still thinking about that. Looking back on it now, I'm sure that his advice was good. I mean, I would never have been able to write Rumpole unless I'd been a barrister at the Old Bailey. And I think it's an enormous privilege to have all sorts of people come and tell you about their innermost lives for a writer. I think for a writer to be a doctor or a lawyer is an enormous advantage. The only trouble was I think I got a bit too good at it for my own good, and I perhaps stayed at it too long. But, of course, I got married quite young.
I was going to ask you that. When you were comparatively young, you married a woman writer with 4 young children. Now, in your book, you don't really give any reasons for this rather bold step.
Madness, I think, probably. I think, really, if I have to think about the reasons, it was because I was a very solitary child. I mean, the whole sort of summer holidays, I would perhaps see nobody, no other children, and I had to do all these plays on my own and take all the parts. And I had these solitary parents. And I think I became quite intoxicated with the idea of this family and the family life. Also, I fell in love, obviously, with Penelope.
You don't actually say that in your book.
Oh, well, then I'm saying it now.
Well, you embarked then on a long career, first at the bar, first at the civil and then the criminal bar, which in fact only ended a few years ago. Now, which of the two courts you appeared in, the civil courts or the criminal courts, gave you the most satisfaction?
Oh, certainly crime. I did divorce and probate, which was actually quite an enjoyable branch
That's
of the
wills,
law.
isn't it?
It's about wills.
Yes.
And you do cases trying to discover whether some old person who's died was mad or not, which is quite entertaining. The thing about probate is you see human nature at its very worst. People arguing about their relatives' money behave appallingly. But then I took silk, and I then did a lot of crime. And then I had a completely new sort of work in which I addressed juries. I talked to juries. The first jury I ever addressed was when I was leading in a murder trial. And it was much more exciting in every way.
In criminal trials that you conducted, were you always a defending counsel, or did you sometimes prosecute?
No,
too?
I always defended.
Were you asked to prosecute?
Yes, but I didn't want to prosecute. And in a way, that came naturally, because if you're a QC who didn't do crime when you were young, you probably don't get into prosecuting. But I always thought there was something, to me, distasteful about using your wits and knowledge in order to cross-examine someone into some horrific penal institution.
Even if you were a neutral figure, really?
Yes, but then it's not much fun being a neutral figure. I mean, that's why it's much more fun defending, because you don't have to be. If you're a prosecutor, you should be a neutral figure. You're very often not.
Did you ever refuse to defend anyone?
No, the only client I ever turned down was a man who wanted a divorce, and he was accused of doing the most horrible things to his wife. And it turned out that he was an assistant hangman. So I said, out of the room, assistant hangman. I'm not having anything to do with you.
This was before capital punishment had been abolished?
Yes, it was.
Yeah.
But, I mean, the theory, which is a good one, I think, is that, you know, there's no one so unpleasant or that they don't deserve to have their case put as well as it can be put. So I defended fascists, communists, anybody.
Did you ever see a client acquitted whom you had reason to believe was guilty?
Yes, once I did. Once an Italian who I think was a mafia murderer. And he was acquitted without very much trouble at all. It was extraordinary.
It says much for your skills, but doesn't say much, really, perhaps, for the system of justice.
Well, I mean, it is much better, and I think even Lord Goddard, who wasn't the most tender-hearted man, said, it is much better that you have a system in which some guilty people are acquitted and some innocent people are convicted. I mean, it's much more outrageous, I think, that an innocent person should suffer in prison and a guilty person should go free. And I do think that our system, properly operated, has got protections for the innocent.
Did you ever sit on the bench yourself?
Yes, I did. I divorced, but I never sent anybody. I've never sent anybody to prison, but I did divorce people.
What was your mother's reaction to your becoming a judge?
She roared with laughter. It was the funniest thing she'd ever heard in her life. And you, a judge.
Did
you
find that rather dumping?
No, I thought it was pretty funny too.
So looking back, did you think that you did stay at the bar perhaps longer than you should have done?
I find that quite difficult to tell. I certainly have written a great deal more since I left the bar. And whether that's sort of pent up, but I did write the whole time I was at the bar. I mean, I wrote a lot of plays. I never stopped writing. And the way that the bar was organized when I was there helped that, because you're like an actor really. You do a case and then have time off. It's difficult for me to tell.
Yeah. After, I can't remember now how many years, your first marriage did come to an end. Was that a very painful time for you?
Yes, yes, it was. It was a very painful time, and yes, it was.
But I think you and your former wife arranged things quite amicably. There was a certain luncheon, wasn't there, when you...
It was a very strange, a very strange lunch, in which we shared a spare rib, which somehow received both of our, a tooth out of each of our mouths. I'd just been to the dentist, and we bit into this thing, and I left a tooth, and she'd done it thinking about our sadness, bit into it, and we ended up with both a tooth and a spare, 2 teeth and a spare rib.
And was it about this time that you visited psychiatrists?
Well, but very briefly. I think I went on 2 or 3 occasions. I think really because of our marriage was in a...
You weren't ill exactly.
I didn't think I was.
You were just depressed, were you?
I don't think I wasn't ill, and I wasn't clinically depressed. I was wishing to seek advice, I think, about how to deal with this married situation. But I've never had any particular faith in psychiatry. But
did you find out anything about yourself in this period?
Well, no, because I was so frightened of boring these psychiatrists that all I did was to ask about them. And it's rather like when I get interviewed, except by you. I usually learn everything about the person who's interviewing me, and they don't learn much about me. But I was always frightened of boring the psychiatrists. I used to...
You wrote a very funny autobiography called Clinging to the Wreckage. And as I read it, and I was reading it again the other day and laughing very loudly, I wondered how much of it was invention. I don't mean the actual events, but your way of describing them.
Well, I think it's almost impossible to draw these lines. For instance, I talked about my father. I wrote Voyage Round My Father. That was the first thing I wrote about him. And I'm sure that I wrote lines in his dialogue which he never said. But now I would be incapable of remembering which lines he said and which lines he didn't say. And in a way, now, I don't know whether my father's a character in fiction or a real character. When I think about Rumpole and think about my father, I don't really think of them as 2 totally different sorts of things. And of course, if you write any description of anything, you really start writing fiction when you decide what to leave out, because that's an artistic choice. So of course, Clinging to the Wreckage is full of artistry in that the way I present my character, it's not my whole character, of course. And similarly, and not when I've just finished a novel, that novel is full of fact, so that I find these distinctions extremely blurred.
Do you mind unfavorable criticism? Does it affect you?
Yeah, I think it affects everybody, but it affects for about a day, you know. And then you recover. Of course, you always remember it. I mean, you remember bad reviews. And if you don't read them, some kind friend points them out.
John, what about politics? What part has that played in your life?
Well, I've never wanted to be a politician. But I was born, and I think we both were, or brought up in the wartime atmosphere in which there was obviously going to be a great change in society, which we were all fighting for. And it was a wonderful period in which you knew what the goodies were and who the baddies were, wasn't it? It was very simple. And when I went into the film unit and met a wider section of people, I knew that I was vaguely on the left of politics, or progressive politics. And I'd been brought up, or I'd read when I was very young, Auden and Isherwood, and the Spanish Civil War was a kind of great thing of my childhood, my
And
past.
have you been left-wing or Labour all your life?
Yes, and then came the 1945 Labour landslide, which was the most exciting political event of my life, I think, and I sort of drove people to the polls, and from that time onward, yes, I have. But my adherence to the Labour Party is rather like Graham Greene going to the Mass, you know, with more or less conviction.
Tell me about this left-wing ginger group that you and Harold Pinter and Antonia Fraser and others recently joined. What was the object of that?
Well, it occurred to me that all the angry young men, all the left-wing writers of the 60s and before that, had all grown up into crusty old blimps, you know, and had become sort of more way to the right of Genghis Khan. And the papers and the periodicals were being dominated by this excessively right-wing writing, which I thought was extremely depressing. And that the Labour Party, which in my youth had all the writers in it, and it was very hard to find a right-wing writer, even up to the 60s, really, had lost that intellectual support and literary support. And I thought that somehow writers should get together to consider this question and what, if anything, could be done about it. So in about a year ago, a number of writers like Salman Rushdie and David Hare and Michael Holroyd and Margaret Drabble and, as you say, the Pinters met in this perhaps inappropriate setting of Lady Antonia's drawing room, and immediately invoked absolutely a horrified mockery from all the newspapers, which I think probably was its was its great achievement, because that gave it a great deal of publicity, and I think perhaps it just made people begin to think that there were a number of thinking people, at least, who were prepared to support the opposition.
I think that's a slightly optimistic view, John, is it not? I mean, most people found it hilarious.
Yes, they did find it. I'm not quite sure why they found it so hilarious. I mean, it seems very odd when a lot of conservatives can meet and have dinner and drink port, and everybody thinks that's absolutely natural. It seems to be that they think that people who have a certain income are not allowed to be socialists. Now, I don't understand that. I don't know what the figure is. You know, is it over 20,000 a year? You have to be a conservative, sort of law about it. It seems to me that in any other country, and one of the writers should be political, is taken for granted, and secondly, that all left-wing reforms, in fact, come from the middle-class intellectuals. They don't usually come from the working class. So it seemed to be a perfectly natural thing to do. But I think that really it achieved one of its functions, because I think, slightly encouraged by that, a number of other groups have started, like Samizdat and Tessa Blackstone's group and so on. And now the Labour Party is looking more cheerful.
What other plans do you have in the years ahead?
Well, to survive as long as possible before I drop down. I mean, I'd just like to, if I'm allowed to go on doing what I'm doing, I should be profoundly grateful.
You've achieved a lot, and you've made all of us laugh a great deal. Would you call yourself a happy man now?
Yes. Well, insofar as being old is not particularly entertaining, sort of melancholy. But I think I'm happier than I've ever been. I mean, I have a very happy family life. I have a very nice daughter who's 5, which is a great thing for the future. And I've just finished a novel. I think I am happy. I'm incredibly lucky.
Christmas with a special portrait of the prolific and much-loved novelist P.G. Wodehouse.
P.G. Wodehouse is England's best-loved humorous writer. He died at Remsenburg, Long Island in 1975 at the age of 93. The author of over 100 books, he was admired not only by readers the world over, but also by his fellow writers. Evelyn Waugh called him the head of my profession.
I tell you what he did, actually, the thing, you can never, I think, you can never write a simile in a comic novel without being aware that this has been done better, and you know, in fact, you better keep clear of similes. I mean, Wodehouse more or less killed them. I mean, after, you know, she had laughter like, you know, a troop of cavalry, you know, galloping across a tin bridge. I mean, this sort of stuff. I mean, you're stuck with it. Every time you come to a word like, I fade away. I keep well away from it.
Although Wodehouse spent much of his working life in America, he, more than anyone, made Englishness universal. But it's a carefully created England. His legendary characters, Jeeves, Bertie Wooster and Lord Emsworth, are the product of hours of hard, solitary work.
But it was the way he wanted to live. He used to work in the morning, go for a walk in the afternoon, and work again in the evening. Then in the evening he had a cocktail and watched a soap opera. That was his life, and he never wanted to alter it. Well, that means that he spent 2/3 of the waking day, anyway, in the company of Jeeves and Bertie Wooster. And that's where he belonged, in a way.
Tonight's bookmark looks at the life and work of this immensely dedicated writer and follows him through the war years as his timeless, uniquely imagined world collided with reality in its crudest, most uncompromising form. In 1940, a few months before his 59th birthday, Wodehouse was at the height of his literary career. Recently awarded an honorary doctorate by Oxford University, he was living, as he had since the outbreak of the war, at the French provincial town of Le Touquet. Reluctant to return to England because he would have had to leave his beloved dogs in quarantine, Wodehouse and his wife put their trust in the French army and entertained British airmen at their villa, Low Wood, just outside Le Touquet.
He was not exactly shy, but he was a loner, and he loved people to be enjoying himself in his house, exactly like she did. But he would, for instance, if we were dancing to the gramophone, or chatting, or eating, or having a little drink, he would suddenly put his head, there it is, through this door, which led to his...
door here?
Yes, this door here, and there's a little passage through here which leads to the room where he used to do all his writing. And he'd open this door and look round with his sweet smile and very short-sighted glasses and say, "Is everybody happy?" And we'd say, "Yes, thank you very much." And the young men would say, "Why don't you come and join us, sir?" And he said, "No, thank you very much, but I think I'll go back to my work," and he did.
Threatened by the approach of an invading army, they tried to get out, but it was too late. Wodehouse took refuge in his work and viewed the advancing Germans without relinquishing any of his very English irony.
Young men setting out in life have often asked me, how can I become an internee? Well, there are several ways. You can be a grocer in Douai, or a farm labourer at Ambricourt, or a coal miner at Lille. You can be one of the crew of a liner which has been sunk by enemy destroyers. You can be a war grave gardener in the war cemeteries of France. Or, like me, you can settle down in a villa at Le Touquet and get stuck there until the place is occupied. That is as simple a method as any. You buy the villa, and the Germans do the rest. One's reactions on finding oneself suddenly surrounded by the armed strength of a hostile power are rather interesting. The first time you see a German soldier in your garden, your impulse is to jump 10 feet straight up into the air, and you do so. But this feeling of embarrassment soon passes. A week later, you find yourself only jumping 5 feet, and in the end, Familiarity so breeds indifference that you're able to sustain without a tremor the spectacle of men in steel helmets riding round your lawn on bicycles, and even the discovery that 2 or 3 of them have dropped in and are taking a bath in your bathroom. The motto of the German army in occupied territory is, "What's yours is mine," and any nonsense about an Englishman's home being a castle is soon dispelled.
Plum had been to see the consul about 3 days before, and the consul said, "That's all right, don't worry, they won't get through the merry-no line," and so on. So Plum went back to his books and Ethel to her gardening or whatever it was. And then next thing they knew, the Germans on motorcycles in their garden. And after a month or two, all the British citizens in Le Touquet, which included the billiard marker, the golf pro, a few barmen and so on, were rounded up, with under 60 of war-making age, were rounded up and taken off to civilian internment. And that included old Plum, who was 58.